Continue Alexander of Macedon. We are in River of the Sea and River of the Sands, which is chapter 16 of part 3. At this point, with the rafts ready and the regiments lined up in advance, Alexandros gave order to loose the barrage of crossbow javelins. These heavy missiles flashed far across the water, doing not much execution, but amazing the step-riders by the force with which they penetrated wicker shields and leather body coating. The Scythians cleared the river bank promptly, and Alexandros ordered the first rafts into the water. Arrian gives a clear picture of this crossing. Seeing the Scythians confused by the discharge of his missiles, Alexandros ordered the trumpets to sound and keep on sounding. He led the first wave of the crossing. After the leading archers, javelin throwers, and slingers had got to land, he ordered them to advance a little and harness the Scythians with missiles, and to keep the horse archers from charging the first ranks of the infantry phalanx, stepping out of the water until all the cavalry had got across. Cavalry is something else, and one sees that a lot more, so excuse me. Probably at no time, before then or later, did the Macedonians manage to get themselves into such a dangerous position. Alexandros had no experience with the tactics of the formidable horse archers of Central Asia. He got that experience now, and quickly. A skirmish line sent inland from the bank about 2,000 light-armed mixed formations, probably the ones who had first served as a screen, was quickly enveloped and shot to pieces by the Scythians, who merely rode around it. When the main line advanced more cautiously than the Scythians repeated the maneuver, clan groups, stronger than the individual Macedonian regiments, circled close in, losing flights of arrows, and passed quickly out of range. The Macedonians halted. There was no possibility of carrying out their customary attack on the wedge to the right, followed by the thrust of the companion cavalry, because the Scythians were not there to be attacked. They were circling already the rear, riding around at a pace the Macedonian cavalry could not match, and it would be sheer folly for the mass of the phalanx to advance in a square. The phalanx itself was helpless on open ground before the Scythians. Alexandros had to devise a new tactic immediately. He had only one advantage. His disciplined troops, sensing the danger, were now keyed up for rapid action. What Alexandros tried was improved on the spur of the moment, but it worked. Halting the phalanx, he immobilized it, throwing together a column of allied and miscellaneous horsemen. He started it out on one flank, hurrying the mobile Hypaspists after it came to keeping it from being encircled. This thrusting, fast-moving arm could not come to grips with the Scythians, but it penetrated their sweep. Then Alexandros plunged back, took command of the column of companions, and circled with it inward, opposite the other moving arm. So the Macedonians struck left and right, inward, breaking up the clockwise sweep of the steppe cavalry. The Scythians drew back rapidly. The two Macedonian columns, leaving the phalanx up in the air, drove off in pursuit. Close pressed now by disciplined troops, the Scythians turned and ran for it. At headlong speed, flight and pursuit swept away from the river and kept on going. That was the end of it, Arrian says. The Scythians lost 1,000, including a chieftain of the Macedonians identified by name, and left 150 prisoners. Obviously the Macedonian losses had been greater than that, but the moral victory was decisive. The Scythians had been puzzled by the building of the fortified city, and amazed by the swift crossing of the river. They wanted no further encounter with the Macedonians, and had, besides, no incentive to keep up a conflict with these impressive Westerners, except their alliance with Spitama. So, when Alexandros later on led his columns farther along the ridges of the caravan terminus of the stone city, modern Tashkent. Tashkent's one of those places where the earliest Quran manuscript exists. In entirety, because there were two from that set of 7 that were sent out, and the one at Tashkent is the one that survived. But that doesn't really have much to do with this. On this new transcontinental railroad, they realized that he meant to stay, and they sent envoys to agree on a peace. But after the racing pursuit of that day, Alexandros, weakened by dysentery, broke down and had to be carried back to the river in a litter. So Aristander pointed out that the omens had been justified. The army had crossed the river successfully, while the commander had suffered by it. On their return from the thrust to the stone city, and before the Scythian envoys arrived, the Macedonians heard more bad news. The relief column under Karanas, hurrying to reach Maracand, had been trapped by a small river crossing and wiped out entirely. Spitama had been responsible for this, aided by a contingent of Scythians. Evidently, the officers of the column had been unable to meet the tactic of the horse archers. At once, Alexandros got together a flying column of the best of the cavalry and the hardy Agrianians, and started for Maracand. He pushed his relief force grimly, so that Arrian says they covered 135 miles in 3 days and nights. At dawn of the 4th day, At dawn on the 4th day, they descended the valley and sighted the citadel of Maracand, rising from its gardens, but the besiegers under Spitama had heard of their coming and had drawn off to safety. Alexandros relieved Maracand, yet had to content himself with burying the dead of the massacred column. Another winter closed in on the Macedonians. Snow blocked the higher passes, and the troops forsook their tents to take shelter in the stone hillside huts. This was the winter of 329 to 328 BCE. Completely checkmated by Spitama's tactics and the resistance of the wild horsemen who could not be overtaken, Alexandros hung on in the uplands, resorting to extermination methods, laying waste a countryside, forcing the inhabitants further up the slopes into snow, where their beasts had no fodder. During the winter, too, animal life came down to the lower slopes, so the Macedonian hunters could get at this ample source of meat, while the fugitives among them starved. By gathering in the cattle herds and keeping them under guard at the settlement, the Macedonians deprived the inhabitants of their chief stock of food. Meanwhile, it is clear that Alexandros summoned very large reinforcements into this new mountain frontier zone. The yearly quota of recruits from Pella arrived as usual, bringing mercenaries with them after the long march to these Alexandrias in the east. 2 years before, Alexandros had enlisted no such mercenaries, but here had need of colonists trained also as soldiers. In fact, the settlements throughout Bactria and Sogd became populated by Greeks, in the main by exiles. Nearchus and other officers turned up with a mysterious reinforcement brought, the historians say, from the sea, since Alexandros had opened up no sea route as yet. This seafaring contingent must have been drawn from the Semitic mariners along the Mediterranean coast. To these were added reserve regiments from the peasant base at Zadrakarta, and allies, 1,500 of them, appeared unexpectedly from an eastern lake into which they insisted both the river of the sea and the river of the sands, emptied the modern Aralsk Sea. Their chieftains enlisted voluntarily with the victorious Macedonians, and they called themselves Charismians, which the Greek scholars noted down as Krasmians. Their stories of the northern steppes bewildered the Greek geographers, but interested Alexandros of Megas. Their chieftain offered to guide Alexandros to his great lake and supply the army on the way, and led by way of further inducement to show him the Amazons, those women riders who were expert as men with bows. The Macedonians had heard much about the Amazons, but had not been able so far to come upon any living specimens. More, the Charismian promised to get Alexandros Oriel's Scythian bride if he wanted such a woman. Alexandros may have been tempted, but he thanked the chieftain and said he wanted no Scythian marriage. And one wonders if the whole thing about the Amazon was, they wanted women, but they wanted women with the, some of the benefits of men. So, well, okay, that's not really, I could describe that better, but anyways, it's not necessarily that people are gay, although that was acceptable among their army, so we're not saying that. But it was good that they put an end to rape. They didn't allow it anyways. He now disposed of from 100 to 150,000 souls, including the mercenaries and servants, in this limbo of Central Asia. But he was winning over Spitama, not by superior military skill, but by creating fear. The inhabitants were discovering that they could only expect to die, hunted down or starved, unless they joined the colonists. The settlements offered them life and food, even if it meant a different way of life. 2 years before, Alexandros had the country against him. Now he turned the country against Spitama, his ablest antagonist. It was an amazing feat to accomplish in that time and place. The Roman Empire extended its frontiers thereafter by much the same method of leapfrogging armed camps with settlements, which were in turn stiffened by discharged veterans. But the Roman legions were never able to push farther east than the middle Euxine and the general boundary of the Euphrates. Accordingly, they extended west into Spain, Africa, France, and even England. Some of the existence of the Roman Empire is actually said to be mythical. There's a contrary theory, and there's some evidence to that, but why Alexandros Amechas persisted in doing it is difficult to know. His persistence could have been due neither to glory hunting nor to craving for merely geographical conquest. For one thing, he did not enter the Scythian steppes again, or try to match his power with the great Scythian clans, already pushed from behind by the Hunnic clans. Nor did he seem to feel here that he was carrying out a dictate of his destiny. It is more the thought of his journalists than his own thought that he tried to emulate the deeds of Heracles and Semiramis and the heroes of tradition. At times, he did not speak of such legendary achievements, but apparently he did so more to encourage the troops than to inspire himself. Just like having the oracle reader and trying to get the oracle reader, no, speak in our favor, do something again. The people had superstitions and beliefs that maybe you wouldn't call superstitions, but you got to work with the fact that people believe or disbelieve differently than you do. Alexandros was always inclined to worry at difficulties until he mastered them. He hated failure or retreat, but it's probable that he determined already to push on through the Para Panisades, Hind Iku, into the lands of the Indus. If so, full control of the Bactria-soaked highlands had to be gained. Already he had discovered the danger of pushing on when the rebellion could stir up behind him. Then, too, he had shown a disposition to match the characteristics of the peoples he encountered. At Persepolis, he had taken pride in doing as the Persians did. Here he shared the wild life of the steppes, with the folk moving ever on horseback over vast distances, dancing to the music of their pipes and drums. They had a proverb that only a man who sat in the saddle was free. The one who sat in a house was a slave. Well, we're all slaves to something, right? They had saddles too. Alexandros showed a naive eagerness to emulate the Bactrian Scythian warrior. This total war of 2 years took its toll from the army, not only in wounds and suffering. The ordeal embittered the men, hardening them to other suffering, and those who emerged on the far side of the Panicetus had gained a capacity to hate as well as to endure. They had been divided up also into 5 commands under Hephaestion, Ptolemy, Perdiccas, Coenus, with the Persian associate, and Alexandros Omachus himself. During the winter, those 5 armies had hunted Spitama through the heights, giving him no chance to rest or recruit followers. It was Coenus's command that cornered the brilliant rebel. After Spitama had surprised and devastated one of the new settlements, Spitama was killed by his own men and his head sent down as a peace offering. His men had heard that Alexandros was hurrying up, and they were afraid. This did not end the resistance. These barbarians go willingly from war to war, Audrian relates, because they are ever troubled by poverty, and having no cities or fixed home sites, they are held back by nothing that they cherish and fear for. Well, that's overstating. It turns out that the richest countries in in the modern age are the ones that are the most warlike and most abusive of the homestead and that sort of thing. But after ridding themselves of Spitama, however, the Macedonians made efforts to conciliate the stubborn folk. One town on a cliff held out because the inhabitants believed no human beings could manage to cross the ravine that led to it. Yet, the Macedonian engineers drove pegs into the cliff sides and built up a trestle from the bottom during snow and sleet storms. When the trestle reached as high as the town wall, the inhabitants gave up.